Welcome! Welcome indeed to this video module entitled Principles of Persuasion, Strategies for Sales Success. Now, I'm sure that most tuning in today have had some sales experience, and to be sure, many of you are most certainly already sales veterans. Likewise, too, no doubt, most of us have been exposed to at least some sales training. The hope today is that regardless of your previous experiences, you'll find this video unlike most of the sales training you've had in the past. And that is because this video has been designed not only to provide you with a number of highly effective sales techniques and strategies which you can begin to utilize immediately, but you will also come to understand at a psychological level how and why these techniques and strategies work and why they are so powerful. You probably all recall the old parable, give a person a fish they eat for a day, teach them the fish they eat for a lifetime. I guess the goal of this video is really to do both. Now, as sales professionals, you have undoubtedly noticed that every time you go to the bookstore shelf or search the web, there is some new sales book hitting the market, or some individual has a new revolutionary sales method that promises to change the universe as we know it. But can all these books and programs really all be saying something different? Can sales really be that complex? I mean, since there are so many of these books and programs out there, can even 10% of them be remotely helpful? Good question. And the answer is, well, sort of, maybe. That is, consider this. What if all the different techniques suggested or methodologies offered in all of these books, videos, programs, were underneath it all touching upon or otherwise accessing some relatively finite set of fundamental principles that tend to govern how people behave, and therefore how salespersons can use those principles to influence the behavior of others? Tell you what, rather than dwelling on the abstract, let's just go to an example that should be able to nicely illustrate what we're discussing here. It happens that not long ago, a group of well-regarded university-based researchers and academics conducted an experiment. In conjunction with this experiment, participants were recruited, and on the day of the experiment, which was simply described as a wine tasting, those participants were escorted to tables where, upon sitting, they were presented with and asked to taste and rate 5 bottles of wine. Each bottle had its label removed, but the pricing information was still evident. Bottles priced between $5 and $90. Now, I bet you could already guess where this is going. That's right. The $90 bottle was preferred almost unanimously to the $10 bottle, even though in fact the two bottles contained exactly the same wine. And all of this simply to illustrate that clearly, there are certain thinking patterns that we are all conditioned with beginning from the time we were small. One of those being, for example, that more expensive tends to mean something is better, hence the preference for the $90 bottle of wine. But to be sure, expensive equals better is not the only decision-making shortcut that we've developed. Indeed, the world is a complicated and confusing place. And as humans, simply as a matter of survival, we have learned to rely, in addition to our own analytical abilities, on our cognitive conditionings, our instincts, and certain fixed action patterns when it comes to decision making. It's almost as if we have software CD in our head, and when we're confronted with certain scenarios, like the wine experiment, we slide in the disk, activate the software, and click whir like a automaton, we begin to act out some usually less than optimal procedural subroutine consisting of a set of behaviors which one noted psychologist has referred to as unthinking. So, does that psychologist fellow have anything else to offer? Perhaps something more actionable? Actually, yes, he does. In fact, let's meet the good doctor now. Dr. Robert Cialdini received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina and did his postdoc work at Columbia. He has had a number of noteworthy visiting scholar appointments and currently holds a Professor Emeritus title at Arizona State University. Impressive to be sure, but more specifically, it has been Cialdini's exceptional research in the fields of influence and persuasion that has elevated him to the status of luminary in these fields. Much of Dr. Cialdini's work has been included in his New York Times best-selling book entitled Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, a book that has enjoyed much acclaim and certainly has facilitated Dr. Cialdini's assembly of a vast corporate client base, which includes Google, Microsoft, Cisco, Bayer, and others. Earlier in this video, we hypothesized there might be some intrinsic set of fundamental principles that the myriad of sales books and sales programs all tended to address in some fashion or the other. Indeed, according to Dr. Cialdini, this is the case. And in his book, Cialdini states, although there are thousands of different tactics that compliance practitioners employ to produce yes, the majority fall within 6 basic categories. Each of these categories is governed by a fundamental psychological principle that directs human behavior, and in doing so, gives the tactics their power. Cialdini's basic principle of influence, or weapons of influence as he sometimes refers to them, are as follows: reciprocation, commitment and consistency, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. These principles have been universally integrated into the repertoires of the very best influence professionals around the world. And so, let's spend the rest of what little time we have together today getting familiar with and defining these 6 principles and observing them in action. We will then conclude with a brief discussion of how to apply these principles in the course of our daily lives and especially in our roles as BKE sales experts. So let's begin with reciprocation. What is it? Really, it's that deeply ingrained sense of obligation we feel as humans to respond to a positive action with an in-kind positive action. We all know the feeling someone does something nice for us. We have all felt the strain to somehow even the score, as it were. In fact, psychologists and anthropologists have determined that this obligation of reciprocity is so basically human that there is no society on the planet that doesn't subscribe to it. Well, I guess if there's something that is both universal and that powerful, we better have a closer look. All right then, let's proceed by having a peek at this fun and illustrative experiment. Volunteers were solicited to take part in a study about art. From among the volunteers, 2 groups were created. One by one, members of the 2 groups were shown into a survey room where they were shown different works of art and asked to record their impressions. In each case, the volunteer was joined by a member of the research team that was posing as a second volunteer. Some minutes after the study began, the individual researcher would step out of the room, returning shortly thereafter. Now here's the rub. In the case of one of the groups, the researcher imposter would return with 2 refreshing drinks in his hand, stating, "Hey, I was thirsty, so I went for a drink. Figured I'd bring you one too." However, with volunteers from the second group, the researcher would return with only 1 drink for himself. The conclusion of the experiment came a bit later when the art had been reviewed, the beverages consumed, and the surveys were completed. At that point, the researcher, still posing as a volunteer, asked his fellow volunteer if they would be interested in purchasing some lottery tickets for a charity auction. Of course, the question being, would those that received a positive act from the researcher in the form of the beverage be more inclined to return the favor and agree to buy the lottery tickets? Well, it will probably come as no surprise that, by a wide margin, more tickets were purchased in the case where a beverage had been offered. Indeed, reciprocation was at work. But even more interesting is this. The price of the lottery tickets were a dime apiece, and the average purchase by those who received the drinks was 5 lottery tickets, twice as much as those that did not receive a beverage. And the total expenditure, therefore, for the group that received the beverage was 50 cents. Now, this study was done some time ago when the price of soda was only a dime, meaning that not only did the volunteers in Group 1, the group that received the beverage, respond more frequently, they responded such that in monetary terms, the researcher ended up with a 500% return on the beverage investment. Conclusion? Not only does the principle of reciprocation seem to work, it also doesn't seem to necessarily always have to work symmetrically. Good stuff, right? Great. Let's look at another example. This study investigated to what extent diners' tips might vary if those diners were given a small gift along with the presentation of the bill, specifically after dinner candies. The researchers set up the following conditions. Group 1 would receive no candies. Group 2 would receive 1 per person. Group 3, 2 per person. And Group 4 would receive 1 per person initially. The server would then take a step or two away from the table, but then return stating, "You were such great people, y'all get another candy." And here are the results. The use of a candy increased tips by 3%, while 2 candies, presumably viewed by the diners as a more overt and generous gesture, brought tips up by 14%. Pretty compelling. However, in the case where not only did the diners get extra candy, but the wait person made it quite clear that the double candy gesture was personal and intended, tips increased over the no candy control condition by some 21%. Once again, we see the principle of reciprocation working its magic. But there is actually more to reciprocation that meets the eye, because we never said that reciprocation had to come in the form of any tangible gift or even in the form of money, but rather our obligation to reciprocate is triggered by any positive action that we receive, a distinction that will become quite clear in the following example. Okay, new study. Here's the setup. 2 homogeneous groups of college student volunteers. Each asked the exact same question. Would you volunteer to take a group of juvenile delinquent children to the zoo for the day? And the typical response from Group 1, a resounding, no thank you. Okay, Group 2 now, same question. Would you volunteer to take a group of juvenile delinquent children to the zoo for the day? Response, sure, count me in. Wait, what? 2 supposedly homogeneous groups of college students, randomly selected and randomly sorted, and asked an identical question. And yet the collective response of Group 1 versus Group 2 drastically different, with 3x greater compliance coming from Group 2? There has to be an explanation. And in fact there is, because what you don't know is that in the case of Group 2, our happy and willing volunteers, before they were asked, would you volunteer to take a group of juvenile delinquent children to the zoo for the day, they were first asked, would you be willing to serve as a counselor for juvenile delinquents for 2 hours every week for the next 2 years? Only when the Group 2 members said no thank you to the 2-year commitment, and indeed virtually all of them did, were they then asked about spending the day with the kids at the zoo. In other words, after they said no, they were offered a positive act, coming in the form this time of not a Coke or a candy, but in the form of a concession. The concession, so the theory goes, triggered that click-whir software-like algorithm, and feeling the obligation to reciprocate in kind, they suddenly found themselves signing up for a rather unexpected trip to the zoo to be accompanied by a handful of their favorite teen delinquents. All due to that strange and compelling principle, reciprocation. Hey, maybe this Cialdini is on to something. Anyway, let's keep going. Moving to the next principle of influence, let's chat a bit about commitment and consistency. You're the owner of a number of higher-end restaurants, and like every other restaurateur, you are plagued with people making but not honoring their reservations. In fact, according to your host staff, no-shows are averaging as much as 30%. This is really hurting your business, so what do? Well, out of desperation, you ask your receptionists, what are you saying to these people when they call to make reservations? You are promptly told that as per your instructions, after taking the reservationists regularly say to the prospective diners, thank you and please let us know in advance if you need to cancel your reservation. On a hunch, you tell your reservationists going forward instead to ask the prospective diner, will you please call us and let us know if you will not be using this reservation, and wait for a definitive answer. Well, before giving you the punchline, please know that this exact scenario did transpire in a restaurant based in Chicago. Ready for the results? Okay. By simply having the reservationist ask, will you please call us and let us know if you will not be using the reservation, and waiting for a response, which of course was inevitably yes, no-shows promptly went from 30% to 10% and have pretty well stayed there ever since. What made the difference? Not what was said by the receptionist, but what was said by the reservation maker, the diner. Specifically, in replying yes, that they would call to cancel, they made a verbal commitment, a commitment not only to themselves, but out loud to another party. And it turns out as humans, when we make a commitment, and especially when we do so publicly, either verbally or in writing, we feel a particularly strong compulsion to honor our commitments. Just like our expense equals better programming or our obligation to reciprocate, we have been conditioned to follow through when we commit. Tell you what, just to make the point even more clear, let's have a look at another study. All right, it's all pretty simple. Research posing as a tourist is strolling down the beach. He stops and proceeds to take a seat next to another sunbather. As one would, the researcher, not identifying himself as such of course, commences to unfold his beach chair, lay out his towel, set down his beach bag and his radio before proceeding to settle in. After a bit, our faux tourist researcher gets up and proceeds to go for a walk. Once out of sight, a second member of the research team, posing as a thief, happens by and suddenly grabs the research tourist's radio and proceeds to walk away at a spirited pace. The question under study is, will the person that was sitting next to the strolling tourist researcher make an attempt to detain or otherwise apprehend the thief? Well, according to the study, the answer is, it depends. And what it depends on is if a commitment was collected by the researcher from the observer neighbor, or if no commitment was received. You see, the experiment was conducted such that in 50% of the cases before going for the walk, the researcher asked the neighbor on the beach, "Would you mind watching my things while I take a quick walk?" In most cases, the neighbor responded in the affirmative. The other 50% of the time, however, the researcher said nothing before venturing off for the walk, thereby establishing those people with whom no contact was made as the control group. Now, it may interest you to know this study was originally conducted by psychologist Thomas Moriarty at a beach outside of New York City, and that study has become one of the more famous studies in the history of social psychology. In any event, Dr. Moriarty's results were as follows. In the case that a commitment was neither sought nor received, only 1 in 5 times did anyone make any attempt whatsoever to stop the crime. In contrast, on those occasions where the researcher asked the neighbor to please watch his things, people were willing to take action approximately 90% of the time, even if, for all they knew, they were putting themselves in danger. So mighty is the overall power of commitment. Just as mighty and closely entwined with commitment is our tendency as human beings to be consistent with respect to our behavior. Interestingly, it so happens that just as we all seem to have a knee-jerk reaction to reciprocate and to meet our commitments, most of us have an equally strong compulsion toward acting in a consistent manner. Once again, as a matter of our conditioning as people, from an early age we have been taught to value consistency and consistent behavior, and to view those who behave accordingly as reliable, confident, and organized. Consequently, we too want to be seen in such a positive light, which is why we want to be consistent with respect to our own actions. Let's take a look at a couple of other famous studies that have put the principles of commitment and consistency to the test. We take you now to the peaceful confines of Bloomington, Indiana, where psychologists named Stephen Sherman and a team of researchers randomly have reached out via the phone to a sample of good and kindly citizens of that community. The Sherman team advised the residents that they were conducting a survey and asked the residents to predict what they would say if asked to spend 3 hours collecting money for the American Cancer Society. Of course, not wanting to seem uncharitable to the survey taker or to themselves, many of these people said that they would volunteer. The consequence of this sly commitment procedure was a 700% increase in volunteers when a few days later, a representative of the American Cancer Society did call and ask for neighborhood canvassers. What you have just witnessed is actually a common outcome that tends to occur when commitment and consistency interact. In fact, the act of simultaneously pushing the human commitment and consistency buttons in tandem have proven so effective as a compliance tool that one particular configuration of the practice has been given a special name. It's called the old foot in the door technique. Come on, let's have a look at the foot in the door technique in action. Once again, we start with the setup. The researchers chose a residential community in Southern California. They randomly divided the members of the community that they intended to contact into 3 groups. In a door-to-door interaction, groups 1 and 2 were approached thusly. Residents that were designated as Group 1 participants were asked by the research team, who were posing not as researchers, of course, but as social advocates, if they would place a 3-by-3-inch sign in their window containing the simple message, "Be a safe driver." The response to the small request was unanimous and positive. The researchers then contacted those individuals who were randomly assigned to Group 2. These residents were approached and asked the following question: will you put this large billboard in the lawn in front of your house? Not surprising at all, the response rather skewed toward the negative, as in, no. Next, the residents chosen and designated as Group 3 were contacted. These people received a request to sign a petition that supported keeping California beautiful, and of course nearly everyone signed. With those preliminaries out of the way, we can now let the games begin. So, stay with me here, it's about to get fun. With their foot, or feet as it were, securely in the door, the research team then reapproached the residents in Group 1, the small sign displayers, and the residents in Group 2, the petition signers. This time, the researchers asked both of these groups, will you put this large billboard in the lawn in front of your house? The reaction they received was quite stunning. In contrast to the results obtained when Group 2 was asked to display the billboard and virtually all said no, 76% of the Be a Safe Driver group and 50% of the Keep California Clean group agreed to have that large and unsightly billboard installed on their lawn. What could explain these results? Well, according to Cialdini and other experts, once they had acquiesced to a smaller socially minded request, they consciously or unconsciously began to think of themselves as being socially responsible individuals. As such, when asked to perform yet another socially responsible act, their consistency programming took over, and with a click and a whir, they complied with the requests of the researchers much more readily than they otherwise might have. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the old foot in the door technique. Begin with a small request, and once your object of influence has made a modest commitment, their natural tendency toward consistent behavior will allow you to gain their future compliance much more readily. Makes you want to polish up your shoes and practice extending your legs some, doesn't it? But hold that thought for a bit. There's just a little bit more we'll be wanting to cover. So, moving on, let's have a quick look at the nature and power of our next principle of influence. That is of social proof. Grab a friend or two, stop at any corner and look up in the air. Oh, come on, you know what's going to happen. Within 3 minutes, there'll be a crowd around you of people that seem to you like silly lemmings, all staring up at precisely nothing. I mean, really, it's just too easy, right? In any case, our self-indulgent little thought experiment, if nothing else, has nicely demonstrated the potency of social proof when deployed as a weapon of influence. To be sure, human beings have a strong tendency to follow the leader. a phenomenon not lost on the American moralist and social philosopher Eric Hoffer, who quipped, "When people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other." And the research would not only agree, but also inform us that the more others are like us, the more we are inclined to follow them. Once again, let's see what Dr. Cialdini and his peers, past and present, have been up to in terms of understanding the attraction and the variations of social proof. In fact, here's an experiment which the doc designed and conducted personally. In his travels, Cialdini began noticing the proliferation of door hangers and other signs strategically placed inside of hotel rooms, urging guests to recycle their towels in order to save water and protect the environment. The wily doctor saw how this might present for him an opportunity to experiment with the principle of social proof. To do so, he began by obtaining the cooperation of a local Phoenix-based hotel. Cialdini learned that on average 3/4 of the hotel guests would reuse their towels at least once. Having therefore determined a baseline, Cialdini and team went to work. In the first leg of their experiment, the team replaced the existing ecologically based cards and door hangers with a small sign that read as follows: "Join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment." In a study conducted in fall 2003, 75% of the guests participated in our new resource-saving program by using their towels more than once, etc., etc. Cialdini's hypothesis was, of course, that guests would pick up on the behavior of the herd, and like the 75% of the rest of the pack, they too would reuse their towels. And as if by magic, as predicted, within a very short time, the hotel did indeed experience a 20% increase in towel usage over the baseline. Interesting. But the second leg of the experiment, it turns out, is downright astonishing. What Cialdini and team did next was to remove the first set of experimental signs and replace them with the following: "Join your fellow guests in helping to save the environment." In a study conducted in fall 2003, 75% of the guests who stayed in this room, room 321, participated in our new savings program, etc., etc. Now, scientists have long been aware that the more like us others are, the more likely we as humans are to follow the example. But did Cialdini really believe that people would somehow be more inclined to follow the lead of a group of people just because through sheer chance they happened to temporarily one time occupy the same hotel room? Well, as it turned out, he did and they did. And here are the results. Towel reuse climbed to a 35% increase over baseline, 15 points above the previous experiment, and all because of our tendency to, as Hoffer put it, imitate each other. And apparently, it does not take much for us to view another person or group of people as being similar. Well, we have certainly seen the support for the principle of social proof and how the principle can be used to affect desirable outcomes. But, like the invention of fire or Krispy Kreme consumption, if not treated with great care, things can get quickly out of control. Consider this scenario. In an experiment designed to curtail eco-theft at the Petrified Forest in Arizona, different types of signs were posted throughout the park. The first one depicted a number of different sorts of people, all in the process of stealing the precious gems for their own selfish use. That sign read, "Many past visitors have removed petrified wood from the park, changing the natural state of the petrified forest." The next sign showed a single individual absconding with a piece of petrified wood with a circled X superimposed over the picture. That sign read simply, "Please don't remove wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state of the petrified forest." So here's the question. Based on what you know about social proof, what is your prediction of the outcome of the experiment? Go ahead, think about it. Ready? Spoiler alert. 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. That's right, no typo here. While one sign managed to reduce theft by 43%, the other actually led to a rather drastic increase in theft. And I am sure you can guess why. That's right. The first sign all but guaranteed an increase in theft because its message was none other than, go ahead, everyone's doing it. And so if nothing else, the lesson here is, as you all ascend toward the ranks of influence and persuasion ninjas, make sure you understand exactly how and why these weapons of influence work, and that way you could be sure to use your new powers wisely. Well, we have done some great work so far together, and we have managed to get underneath the first 3 of Cialdini's 6 principles of influence. Tell you what, keeping in mind that the brain can only absorb what the seat can endure, let's take advantage of this convenient stopping point and call this the end of part 1 of the Principles of Persuasion Strategies for Sales Success video module. But don't forget to come back for part 2, where we will conclude our discussion of the last 3 principles and talk about how we can master all of these principles and begin making them work their magic for us. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you for part 2.